Legends of the Tower of Babel. This is quite an interesting subject. The Tower of Babel plays a significant role in history, yet relatively little is written or known about it. In the Masoretic text, Genesis chapter 11 covers the story in only 9 verses, and Genesis chapter 10 verse 10 implies that Nimrod was the king of Babel. After the book of Genesis, only the genealogy of the event is mentioned. The event itself is not described again. There are indirect references, but most concern correcting or undoing the effects of the Tower of Babel. For example, Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 9 states, "For then will I turn to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord." Likewise, the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 records many languages being understood as one, many nations hearing the gospel, and nations being gathered. For this essay, I will draw primarily on 3 sources: Josephus, the Book of Jasher, and Legends of the Jews by Ginzberg. There will be a few more sources, but these are the primary ones. The Book of Jasher is of unknown origins. It is an old Hebrew work titled Sefer HaYashar. It was first translated in 1625 in Italy. No original manuscripts survive. The first English translation appeared in 1840. Legends of the Jews is a collection of legends drawn from the Talmud and Midrash. The Book of Jasher and Legends of the Jews overlap because both draw from the Midrash. Josephus writes that, not long after the flood, many people were afraid to leave the mountains and settle in the plains. In Genesis 9, they are commanded to fill the earth. Josephus says the people feared that God would send another flood. He claims they refused to spread out as God commanded. In fact, they believed they would be more easily oppressed if they scattered. This implies that the people already distrusted God and were yielding to their personal fears. What may have caused the fear of leaving the mountains is that the flood did not simply end. Genesis records the flood waters prevailed for 150 days and after that, gradually subsided. Noah did not leave the ark for over a year. The text never says that the water completely went away after that year. The book of Abraham in LDS scripture mentions in passing that it took generations for the flood to recede. In chapter 1 verse 24, it notes that when the land of Egypt was found, it was still underwater. Egypt lies at a much lower elevation in the region. It seems that the first few generations after the flood still saw parts of the waters. This would explain why they feared living in the plains and why they would not listen to God. This is where Nimrod enters the record. Today the name is an insult, largely because of a Bugs Bunny cartoon in which Bugs sarcastically calls Elmer Fudd a little Nimrod. The joke played on the biblical description of Nimrod as a mighty hunter. Most viewers, unfamiliar with the Bible, simply thought the name was funny or invented. Nimrod is the grandson of Ham. When his genealogy in the Bible is given, no time frame is provided. We do not know the lifespans of Ham's descendants or year in their life when their sons were born, making it impossible to date the Tower of Babel precisely. From the genealogy, Nimrod appears as a later son of Cush. According to the Book of Jasher and Ginzberg, he was born in Cush's old age. Genesis states only that Nimrod was a mighty one in the earth and ruler of several places, including Babel. The Bible then falls silent about the founding of Babel, its exact leadership, why the people believed they could build a tower to heaven, and the precise nature of their sins. Both the Book of Jasher and Ginzberg claim that Nimrod founded the city. They further state that he was given the garments of skin originally worn by Adam. Cush received them from Ham, who had stolen them from Noah while Noah was drunk, and then passed them to Nimrod. Ham was cursed for stealing these holy garments. According to Ginzberg, the garments were said to make the wearer invincible and irresistible. Animals would line up before Nimrod so he could kill them easily, and he never lost a battle. He used this ability by gathering armies to his cause and fighting other armies of the sons of Japheth. After defeating the sons of Japheth, he became the recognized ruler of the world. Here are my thoughts on the holy garments and whether they truly gave him an edge. If the garments of Adam are understood as representing the dominion God originally gave mankind over the earth, Genesis chapter 1 verses 26 to 28, then the legends may be portraying Nimrod as claiming Adam's authority through theft rather than divine appointment. This interpretation would explain why the legends associate the garments with kingship, military victory, and universal rule. Rather than merely magical clothing, they become the symbol of illegitimate dominion. Furthermore, in the Bible there are several examples of holy clothes. The most notable are those worn by Aaron, the brother of Moses. These priestly garments could only be worn by the high priest. On Aaron's death, they were transferred to Eleazar, the new high priest. Other priests also wore priestly clothes. However, their benefits are consistently tied to God's appointment and covenant rather than functioning as magical objects that grant power to any wearer. I question whether they would have given Nimrod any power, based on the capture of the ark by the Philistines in 1 Samuel chapter 4. Because the Philistines had no covenant relationship with the Lord, the ark became a curse to them. 1 Samuel chapter 5. They eventually sent it away because its presence brought destruction. If Nimrod wore holy garments without being ordained, they should likewise have been a curse to him, both physically and spiritually. It is also possible that Nimrod began as a good man who later turned wicked, like King Saul or Jeroboam. The book of Jasher, chapter 7, verse 30, claims that Nimrod initially served God and offered sacrifices to him. That statement supports this possibility. If he was truly serving God at the beginning, the garments might have functioned as an aid, similar to how the ark benefited Israel while they remained in covenant. Once he turned away, however, those same garments would no longer have protected or empowered him. According to Ginzberg in the book of Jasher, all the people brought Nimrod offerings and subjected themselves to him. Having won several battles and now ruling the world, he grew extremely arrogant. At this point, Ginzberg said that his impiousness kept pace with his power. Here is where I believe that if he had once been good, this was the moment he stopped worshiping God and established a new religion. Back to the story. He was claimed to be the greatest sinner of his time. Only his son Mardon surpassed him. In his arrogance, Nimrod made idols and compelled the people around him to worship them. According to Josephus, although his people were prosperous, Nimrod insisted their success came from their own genius and power. Ginzberg describes him thus: "Since the creation of the world, there has been none like Nimrod, a mighty hunter of men and beasts, and a sinner before God. He turned the people away from God and then set himself up as a god. He built a four-tiered throne in imitation of God's throne, constructed of iron, copper, silver, and gold, with a precious stone for a seat in the golden level. As he sat upon it, the people came to worship him." According to Ginzberg in the book of Jasher, Nimrod took counsel with his advisors to build a tower to reach God and to make his reign absolute. Quick aside, the Babylonian word Bab-Elim or Bab-Elu was understood as Gate of God. Back to the story, Nimrod with his counselors searched for a place to build a city and a tower. The valley of Shinar was chosen. According to Josephus, the people who gathered there prospered and multiplied. Again, God commanded them to send out colonies, but they refused. They also refused to acknowledge that their prosperity came from God. Nimrod claimed sole responsibility for their happiness and changed their government into a tyranny so that his subjects would stop worshiping God and depend on him instead. He portrayed service to God as weakness. Ginzberg in the book of Jasher claimed that Nimrod's purpose in making the tower was to wage war on God and take revenge for the destruction of their ancestors. The plan was to invade heaven, overthrow God by physical force, and install idol gods in his place. Josephus said the tower had a second purpose. It was to be so high that another flood could not reach its top. With this plan, the people began making bricks. At this point, I want to show that he is the opposite of Adam. Adam ruled the world by divine appointment, coexisted with the animals, ruled through delegation and self-accountability, taught his descendants to worship God, and attempted to establish a righteous covenant society. His descendant Enoch later succeeded in establishing such a society as the city of Zion. Nimrod stole royally appointed clothes and appointed himself ruler, ruled by tyranny, demanded worship of himself, attempted to overthrow God, and built a city to fight God. From the genealogy of Shem in the Bible, we can obtain only a general time frame for when this event happened. The division of languages occurred in the days of Peleg. Peleg was born 101 years after the flood and lived 239 years, placing the Tower of Babel somewhere between 101 and 340 years after the flood. I would guess that Peleg was an adult when the event occurred, and that it happened some years before his death, narrowing the range somewhat, but this remains only a guess. The legends describe the tower as a project that was worked on for many years, although none of the sources give an exact construction time. Josephus does not say how many years the tower took to build, but he states that because of the large number of workers and their diligence, it rose much faster than anyone expected. Both the Book of Jasher and Legends of the Jews claim it became so tall that climbing it took a year to reach the top. Bricks became more valuable than human life. If a man fell to his death, the workers wept only for the lost bricks. If a brick was dropped, they mourned the time required to replace it. No one even looked at a fallen worker. Ginzberg adds that women continued working while pregnant, stopping only long enough to give birth. They then tied the newborn in a blanket to their bodies and resumed making bricks. The tower was built of burnt brick and bitumen, the bitumen making it watertight. Josephus notes that when viewed, it appeared shorter than it actually was. When it reached a certain height, the builders began shooting arrows toward heaven. The arrows fell back covered in what looked like blood, leading them to believe they were killing the inhabitants of heaven. This is my take on the arrows. I think they were iron-based. They may simply have rusted, producing a blood-like appearance. The absence of any account of bodies falling would give them little reason to conclude that they had actually struck anyone. At this point, an important question arises that none of the sources fully answers. Why did Nimrod and the builders believe they could physically reach heaven? Genesis simply says that they desired to build a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. Josephus, Legends of the Jews, and the Book of Jasher expand upon this by claiming that the builders intended to wage war against God. While these traditions explain their intentions, they do not explain why they believe such a plan could succeed. One possibility is that the builders believed they could actually see something in the heavens worth attacking. The detail about shooting arrows only makes sense if they thought they had a visible target. Yet none of the sources, Genesis, the Book of Mormon, the Book of Jasher, or Legends of the Jews, explain what that target was supposed to be. There is an early Latter-day Saint tradition that the builders of Babel intended to reach the translated city of Enoch. Orson Pratt taught that they possessed a tradition concerning Enoch's translation and believed that his city existed above the earth. A statement in George Lobb's notebook goes further, claiming that the city was still visible because the veil had not yet hidden it from view. The Book of Moses provides some possible support for the continued existence and accessibility of the city. Moses chapter 7 verse 21 states that Zion was taken up into heaven, while Moses chapter 7 verse 27 says that, during the generations preceding the flood, people who accepted God were caught up by the powers of heaven into Zion. This indicates that the city of Enoch continued to exist as a destination, and that additional people were taken there long after its original translation. It could also have kept knowledge of the city current among the people living before the flood. However, the scripture does not state that the city itself remained visible from the earth. This leaves an interesting chronological question. According to the biblical chronology, Enoch was taken approximately 669 years before the flood, and at least 770 years before the earliest period associated with Babel. The continued translation of righteous people into Zion could explain how knowledge of the city survived until the flood and was then passed through Noah's family to later generations. It might even suggest that people on earth could observe something associated with these translations, although the scripture does not say this. What remains unexplained is why the city of Enoch itself would still have been physically visible from the earth hundreds of years later. Therefore, the Latter-day Saint tradition provides a possible explanation for what the builders of Babel believed they could reach, and the Book of Moses provides some support for the continued existence and accessibility of Zion. However, the specific claim that the builders could actually see the city remains an extra-scriptural tradition rather than something directly stated in Scripture. Back to the main story, at this point the accounts become very similar to the biblical narrative, adding only a few details. God comes down to see the city and tower, accompanied by 70 angels, and changes the people's language. The Book of Jasher says the change occurred in a single day, while the Bible itself does not specify how quickly it happened. Evidence from other sources, however, suggests the confusion may have been more gradual. In the Book of Mormon, The brother of Jared and his companions are present at the Tower of Babel and witness the languages beginning to change. They ask God to preserve their language, and he does. Descriptions in the book of Jasher and Ginzberg also point to a progressive process. When a worker asked for mortar, he received a brick, and in frustration, he would sometimes kill the person who handed it to him. Many died in these fights of misunderstanding. The fact that workers still seem to understand most of a sentence implies that only parts of their speech were changing at first, rather than everything shifting all at once. Yes, it does appear that the book of Jasher contradicts itself in these statements. The book may be just missing a clarification statement. After the changing of languages, the book of Jasher and legends of the Jews become strange. They claim that as punishment for trying to enter and fight against heaven, 1/3 of the people were turned into apes, elephants, and phantoms, and another third were killed by the sword, and the final third were scattered. I do not believe people were literally transformed into animals. In my view, the legend more likely means they began behaving like animals, and the huge death count was added to make the event more dramatic. On all accounts, the people then abandoned the tower and scattered across the earth. The very name of the place reflects what happened. There is a wordplay between Babel and the Hebrew Balal, meaning to confuse. What became of the structure itself? Josephus claims storms knocked it down after it was abandoned. The other two sources say fire consumed a third, an earthquake swallowed a third, and the remaining third stood in ruins. That remnant was said to have a circumference equal to a 3-day walk. In most ancient societies, a day's journey was roughly 20 miles, making the ruins comparable in scale to Mount Shasta. This detail makes sense if they were constructing a man-made mountain rather than a simple ziggurat. I doubt it truly took a year to climb. Climbing Everest takes 6 to 8 weeks, even without stairs from the base. But the legend insists on a year. The remains may still exist, though they would now look like a mound of earth. A final note concerns the scattering itself. Josephus states that the people gathered according to language, and then went out in every direction. Some even crossed the sea in ships. This detail aligns with the Book of Mormon account of Jared's party, who also built ships and crossed the ocean. Josephus notes the fact of their departure, but does not know where most of these groups ultimately settled. He further observes that later peoples, especially the Greeks, often claimed credit for the most ancient names and places, obscuring the earlier movements of these scattered groups. In the end, the legends surrounding the Tower of Babel do more than fill in the gaps left by the brief biblical account. Many questions remain. What is the complete story? Are any parts of these legends true? As they stand, the traditions portray a people who refuse to trust God, a ruler who claimed divine authority for himself, and a project that aimed to challenge heaven itself. They also show that God still accomplished his purpose. The scattering both judged their rebellion and gave the nations a fresh opportunity to seek him. Above all, the story makes clear that heaven can only be reached on God's terms. I hope someday we will know the full account.